Hello everyone, my name is David Scott, book lover extraordinaire, and today we're talking about Frankenstein. Before we go any further, I want to point out a website I found that has up to 209 essays alone on it, along with other content related to the Frankenstein story. I'll leave a link in the description and I'll post one here on screen. So Frankenstein is a book written by Mary Shelley. It was her first novel. It came out of a creative writing competition. Everyone pretty much knows the story about that. This is a series I'm doing on sundry observations, so there's all kinds of stuff you're going to find online about Frankenstein. It has been done from here to eternity. First off, there's the difference between the 1818 and the 1831 versions. It always drives me nuts when there's more than one version of a novel or a movie or anything, because then it's like, how do you get any kind of definitive answer on what the story is actually about? I am a fan of the 1831 version because it's the first version that I've read. I'm totally fine with it, and as I did my research on the differences between the two, I found that the 1831 version is detested. That's what one blogger proclaims. So it's kind of like, I thought it was interesting in that the monster itself is detested in the book, and the 1831 version of the book is detested. So it's kind of a conceptual pun. At any rate, the 1831 version is written by Mary Shelley, so how could you detest it? That makes no sense to me. Maybe the 1818 version is more to what her original vision means, but really, what does that mean? When an author goes through and revamps and beefs up and works on a piece and then completes it, I look at that latest piece as the definitive version. I'm only going to point out a couple of the differences that, here's a link to every known difference between the two versions for you. What I'll do is I'll just point out the two that are kind of important to me, and the rest of them are kind of, there's all different ways you can go with it. There's Elizabeth Lavenza's origin in the 1818 version. She is the daughter of Victor's father's sister, so she's Victor's cousin, and they're destined to get married. In the 1831 version, Elizabeth Lavenza, as I understand her, and from my read of it, because I read the 1831 version first, she is an orphan, and so Caroline, Alfonsi's wife, which is Victor's mother, she finds her Elizabeth on one of her philanthropic adventures and brings her home as a present to the family, and everything is wonderful and it's all peace and flowers from there. Of course, we know it's bound for disaster, but up to that point, it's a very wonderful and heartwarming thing. The other person who experiences a difference in sort of character makeup is Ernest. In 1818, Elizabeth proposed that Ernest should be a farmer, and Victor's father, Alphonse, he suggested that maybe Ernest should go into law, but it's kind of heavy duty. Ernest likes to spend time wandering around the woods and the forest. He had been sickly, and so he gets better by kind of venturing out, and he's kind of in this. It kind of reminds me of, or strikes me as someone who's a little aloof maybe, but maybe not just kind of exploratory, but he doesn't really know what he wants to do, unlike Victor, who's determined to go in science. In 1831, things change. Instead of Elizabeth wanting him to become a farmer, it's him who wants to decide for himself what he wants to do, and that's to go into the Swiss military. Alphonse is not having it. He doesn't like it. And so we don't really know anything else about Ernest after that. So, because from there it all takes a downhill slope. Although I would argue that it's interesting in that Ernest seems to be the only one that we don't learn about his death. Everyone else pretty much meets a grim end. Victor, after the death of Justin, who dies because she was framed for William's death, Victor is suddenly traumatized because not only are two people that he knows and are dear to him gone, but he has a secret that he has to harbor. Tremendously traumatizing for him. He's experiencing grief. He needs to cope. And one of the things that I sort of was able to identify with as a creative writer myself, or as someone who has also been, experienced certain things in life, Victor takes to this habit of meditating on the lake in a boat. And that's at Bellerive. It's on Lake Geneva, and it's really beautiful. And late at night, he escapes onto the boat, and it provides this sort of insight, and it's really brought out by the language that Mary Shelley knows how to use. Her creative writing style is really on target in this book, though she takes it with her wherever she goes. And so it's that writing style that's really descriptive, but to the point at the same time, that we really get this insight into the experience that Victor has to go through and how he has to cope by being on this lake and finding this way to sort of sort through his thoughts. And it's a human thing that we all have to do. We experience things and then we have to process them, and that's just something that we have to do, or we'd probably all explode. We have these ways of coping. Unfortunately, there are other ways like substance abuse and alcohol. This is a much healthier way of doing it, by just finding peace of mind. Of course, he's in Switzerland, and a lot of people who experience trauma are living in the inner city, so there's no need to go any further there. But nevertheless, we have the instance of nature providing sort of a panacea to the problem of grief and trauma. He, of course, experiences suicidal thoughts even, and the nature and everything around him helps him to sort through those thoughts, and he thinks about how that could affect Elizabeth mainly, and of course anyone else that he has left in his life. He meditates further the next day on his journey to Mont Blanc, and these are just, it's so, everything that he's gone through is just forcing him into this zone of just ongoing. It doesn't happen overnight. It takes time to deal with the kind of things that he's dealing with, knowing that there's a murderer out there and that he's lost two people, and it's unpredictable. He can't find the monster. Obviously, there's no way to do anything, and so he's just kind of in this zone of trying to cope. Really, it even says that his grief was subdued and tranquilized. So that's this subdued and tranquilized moment is nature sort of tending to the human condition. And I think that's profound, just only because, well, primarily, I mean, we read these novels, and as not critic and not a creative writer, if I'm just a big fan of reading books, then I'm reading them and I'm looking for things that I can relate to. The construct. So Victor is emerging out of this state of meditation, and he's climbing up the side of Mount Blanc, and there's glaciers around, and he's seeing lightning dancing around on the thunder tops, and that's part of the romantic sort of intensity of the sublime, is that intense mountain. Nature is peaceful, but it's also intimidating. But at any rate, my understanding of this moment is that the white of the mountainside almost reminds me of the construct in the Matrix. And so we are entering into the zone of the mind, and this is this space where there's no one else around but Victor, and he sees the being, his creation, marching up the mountainside at him, towards him, and that it's like it represents the construct of the mind. And in his mind, you could think of the monster, the creation, the being, and Victor as one person, all this unfolding inside one brain, and that it would be Victor's conscience marching towards him to sort of force this. He's had his grieving period, and he's had his moment of solitude and silence, and now here comes reality in the form of his conscience, in the form of the creation marching towards him to just lay into him about his problems and everything that's going on. But really what it is, it's Victor's own, this is what he's creative. It's his own problem, and he has to deal with it. And that's kind of what reality is. I mean, the creation is, a symbolic of reality. You wake up in the morning, you gotta do what you have to do. And the monsters, the monster, the creation, he's there to make Victor do his bidding. The frame narratives, if they were put into physical form, would probably resemble a set of Russian dolls. So Victor's story is couched within Walton's story, which bookends the book front and back. Walton is on an expedition. He's writing to his sister. He's trying to achieve something for himself. He encounters the creation and Victor chasing him on the ice. And so Victor goes aboard, and then we start learning about Victor's story. Victor ends up on the side of Mount Blanc, and up comes the being, and we start learning about the being's story. Once we start learning about the being's story, we start getting information on the cottager's story. Of course, back to the being, his story is the fact that he was, created, and he had these experiences. He's like, Mary Shelley goes through this process of describing what it must be like to just suddenly wake up and experience consciousness and all this stuff. And so it's in this process of being in the woods and abandoned by Victor and just not knowing what to do that he encounters the cottagers after encountering other people who kind of, tell him to go away because he's so awful and terrible. And so the cottagers are the DeLacy family, and there's Felix and Agatha and the old man who's their father, and they're exiles from France, and they're just kind of living in this little shack trying to make ends meet. And it's through them that we learn about Safi, the Arabian Christian whose mother was an Arabian Christian, and that's how she became an Arabian Christian. And so not only are we learning about Safi, but it goes down the scale into the smallest Russian doll, which is Safi's mother, and the story of her father being a merchant who, you know, he ends up almost getting executed by the French. At any rate, there's a lot involved there. It's not so much the stories themselves, but it's this process of, you know, bookending and then bookending and then bookending and then bookending down to the smallest story. It's just only someone like Mary Shelley could have done that. Though it's probably been done by other Victorian writers and people of that era, but it's really noticeable here. So that's Frankenstein. My impression really is the duality sort of thing. We could look at this being, this creation that Victor's created, and Victor as being two sides of one person, and there are videos that you can find and different information you can find on the duality of Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus. That's what the book's called. My ideas on just the generous level for this video are that, you know, Frankenstein is a story about someone who's playing God, and there are moral, ethical quandaries that are involved when you go that route. You're playing games with science, and that's kind of, there's a very real side to that idea in the story of Oppenheimer. He helped to create the atomic bomb, which was a monster to the world. So if you want to do more research on that. There's also the processing of grief and trauma, Victor's meditations on the lake, and he has a moment by the window where he's got these different ways of just thinking about what he's done and how it's affecting him, and he's just trying to do everything that he can to cope, because that's what you have to do when you can't, well, when you experience something, but also he's in a situation of not being able to control something. So if you can't control it, then you have to kind of cope with it, and you have to deal with it. And of course there's duality, and so here's my pitch on duality, and that's one is that Victor is ambitious and he's arrogant and he's intelligent, but then he becomes regretful. The being, by contrast, is sensitive, docile, and meek, but when he starts getting the treatment by everyone, he becomes vengeful. So one becomes regretful, the other one becomes vengeful. But then there's this curious inversion in which, once Victor starts understanding more about what's going on and what the monster is doing, and enough time passes and enough, you know, bodies have piled up, Victor becomes vengeful. But then when Victor dies and the being shows up to where Victor has died, suddenly the being is no longer vengeful, he's regretful, and he commits suicide. So they invert their feelings, and it comes out to a perfect duality there. So that's my take on Frankenstein. Those are just sundry observations. I hope you've enjoyed this brief video for what it is, and for any ideas that you may have been able to glean from it. And I hope to see you in the next video.